Author, psychiatrist, coach, and brain researcher, Dr. Srini Pillay is Phyllis's guest on Profonde TV. Dr. Pillay is one of Harvard Medical's most exciting innovators challenging old theories about the brain. His newest book is Tinker Dabble Doodle Try, Unlock the Power of the Unfocused Mind.
We are talking with Dr. Srini Pillay. I am just delighted to have you as a guest. I'm very grateful for the fact that you are willing to be on the show. You're a very busy person. Dr. Pillay, what is your actual work? What do you do?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to talk with you, Phyllis. I think just from our brief conversation so far, I know I'm going to be having a lot of fun. So in terms of my work, I do a lot of different things. I'm a psychiatrist, and I have a clinical practice in psychiatry. I am also a brain imaging researcher. So I studied brain blood flow for 17 years in a lab at Harvard, where I am a part-time assistant professor of psychiatry. I also work in biotechnology, where I work across a number of different diseases in cancer, heart disease, stroke, looking at drugs that are in early stage development to help investment companies try to understand how they can bring these, whether they should be bringing these drugs, whether they should be investing in them to make sure that they will reach phase 3. So I give them an opinion on that. I also am an executive coach, and as an executive coach, I run a company called Neuro Business Group, which is a leadership development company, a transformational leadership development company, and I work with Fortune 500 companies and also a number of nonprofits like the World Bank and the United Nations and the IMF to help leaders develop a stronger sense of self. I'm also a co-founder or founder of 3 technology companies that I'm currently bringing to market, and I have just finished writing an operetta, a musical, which I'm hoping to get on Broadway. So I work in a number of different things, all of which I feel are just related to my heart and the way in which I want to work in the world.
Well, now, my question to you as to what do you do was a little bit of a trick question, because here you've answered all these things that you do, yet you've written a book called Tinker Dabble Doodle Try, Unlock the Powerful Unfocused Mind. Now, I can't imagine that you have time to tinker, dabble, doodle, or even just try. Or am I wrong?
I do. So I work hard and I also play hard. And I think for me, it's been a lifelong journey of learning how to play hard and when to play hard. And so I think in the answer to your question is sometimes I get off track. I move off of the unfocused zone into hyper-focusing. And whenever I do that, I find my life and my work gets worse. So I'll give you an example. When I got to Harvard, I'm from South Africa originally. So I got here and I was a typical immigrant. People work really hard, stayed extra long hours, needed to prove myself, that kind of thing. And at the end of my first quarter, I was like, I totally crushed this. Like I stayed in the units every hour. I went to every didactic. I worked really, I'd read everything I was supposed to. And so when I went to my first quarterly review, I thought, I can't imagine I'm going to be hearing anything negative here. And so my supervisor said, nice to meet you. Glad we met so early on in the program. You clearly know more than anybody in your class. That's great. You spend more time with your patients than anyone else does. That's great, but we're worried about you. I was like, worried about me? Like, for what reason? And he said, well, you're going to 100% of your didactics, which shows no discernment. And we don't see you sitting on the park benches talking to your colleagues. We don't see you going off to Walden Pond for a quick swim. And to tell the truth, if we wanted to train automatons, then we would have told you to behave like one. But we want to train real thinkers that are going to change the world. And in order to be a real thinker, we really believe you need to build these breaks into your schedule, or else you're never going to be able to develop out your thought. You're going to absorb a lot of thought, but you're never going to be able to develop it. And it really sort of struck me because I'd had one prior experience, which was at medical school, where I did really well at high school. My first year, I feel like I did as well as I wanted to. My second year, my grades suddenly slumped. And I was like, what's going on? Like, why am I doing poorly? Because I was working day in and day out. I literally would go to sleep with bones all over my face, trying to learn them and trying to figure out where the attachments for different muscles were. And I was like, God, I've never worked harder. And so in my third year, I decided to completely change. I said, you know what? Obviously, this amount of work is not helping. I built meditation into my day. I took breaks. I started playing badminton. I went to parties on Friday evenings. All of a sudden, like, I was at the top of my class. And I graduated at the top of my class with that attitude. And so I feel like whenever I go off course into just work, I have to remind myself I am not operating at my highest. And I wrote that book because I wanted to explain to people how to intelligently take breaks so that we are doing the most for our brains and giving ourselves the best chance that we can give ourselves in order to reach our goals.
You make a powerful argument in the book about rhythms. You say that there is a rhythm. Can you talk more about that? Because, I'm afraid that if I take a break, I won't want to come back from the break. Okay,
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
Well,
tell me about rhythm.
I think we know those feelings. So in the brain, a lot of people think that they just got to do focus all day, and they will get the most done if they just focus. Now, most people's days are focus fatigue. And the brain is really wired so that we need to build unfocused periods into our day so we can go focus, refuel, and unfocus, focus, refuel, and unfocus. So you're always operating with a brain that has been refueled. And so the rhythm of focus and unfocus is about having a brain that's being used but refueled constantly throughout the day. Because by the time you're at 3 p.m. in your day, you don't want to be at a point where your entire brain is just depleted of energy. And so many people do this. They say, no, I just got 2 more things to do. I've got 2 more chapters to read. I got to get through this. But what they don't realize is that they're not operating at their optimum. And so this is cognitive rhythm, which is the rhythm between focus and unfocus that we need to build into our days.
You almost speak about it as if it's as natural as breathing in and out. Is that an accurate assessment of what you're talking about?
I think it should be. In our brains, there are brain waves, there are the focused brain waves, the alpha and beta waves, and then the delta and theta waves are more unfocused. So it is a rhythm of brain waves that we can tap into and go out of. And it is that natural. The problem is our lifestyles have put us in this position where we feel like to get the most out of life, we just have to work. So people get up in the morning, they try to get their food together. If they have kids, they're trying to take care of their kids. And they're like, okay, I got to get to work. I've got 10 things on my checklist. I'm just going to be putting all this off. If they can't focus on that, then they're thinking, maybe I need ADD medication. And this book is not about, I respect focus. Like, I think focus is super important. However, I believe that you are doing yourself an injustice if you don't deliberately build unfocus into your day. And so to that extent, the reason I wrote the book is because I don't think it's that natural for us to take breaks and feel okay about it. I think for lots of philosophical reasons, actually. When I delivered a program to a group of people at London Business School a couple of years ago, and one of the head of the innovation leaders sort of asked me, he said, you know what, I buy what you're saying. Like, unfocus is cool. I get my best ideas in the shower, so I know what this is. But I would feel really guilty if I built unfocus into my day. And I said, well, I've got news for you. Number one, every human being, studies have shown, all of us, including me and you, spend 46.9% of our days daydreaming. So our brains go off on a little trip of their own for close to half of the day. And if we don't learn how to do that effectively, we're just wasting that time. So that's the first thing. At a more philosophical level, I'd like to turn to Kierkegaard, the philosopher, to explain why it is this person and why we all feel guilty about this. Kierkegaard said, anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. That actually we all say we want to be free, but in reality, when we are free, it's like being without gravity. And so we're freaked out in that space and we become really anxious. So we build balls and chains into our lives. So we've got valid excuses to never leave the ground. We may not feel anxious that we're floating out, but as a result, we are never free. So if you look at how we construct our lives, from morning to evening, it's like, fill, 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 fill. Like, and people do this with their social obligations. I can't tell you how many times I meet people and they say things like, oh, I can't do this. I'm married. I've got 3 kids. I'm too busy. I've got to go to work. Now you're telling me maybe for my freedom, I need to have an entrepreneurial job. Like, it's just not possible. And I think it's very reasonable to be in that position. But I think everybody in the world should be thinking, am I building these balls and chains into my life, or am I actually living to be free? Because there's a really interesting psychological theory behind this, which is a theory called repetition compulsion. And it turns out Sigmund Freud and a bunch of other psychologists, he was actually a neurologist, but Sigmund Freud and a bunch of other psychologists were sort of standing around looking at the way children behave. And, as experimental psychologists can be pretty serious people. So they were like, this is very weird behavior. They were looking at a baby in a cot and they were like, this baby is playing with a teddy bear, or a toy, and that's fine. But then they're like, the baby threw the toy out of the cot. And they're like, that's a weird behavior. Why would you take your own possession and throw it out? Then the baby starts crying. Now they're like, this is an even weirder thing. It's your toy, you threw it out, now you're crying. And then the mother brings the toy back, and the baby gets really happy. And then when the mother turns around, the baby throws the toy out again. So for a long time, people were saying things like, well, that's just how babies play. They're playing with their mothers. But what these psychologists said was, there's something a little strange here because it seems to mimic human behavior. It seems like the baby is trying to master being disappointed. And what they said was that a frightening thought is that we may be we may be wired to master disappointment rather than seek fulfillment. So we basically want to be really great at the fact that life can suck. And so if we're like, I can take on any challenge, we make challenges. If we want to say, I can do whatever I want to do, you will seek out negative events so that you can overcome them and say, I'm very good at overcoming challenges. But what about that freedom? What about that state that will actually not be about balls and chains? For a lot of people, they say, it's too late. My life's already jam-packed. But what I will say to you is that in this book, I describe ways in which you can, in a manageable way, build very discrete periods into your day and into your life so that you can change things around.
I think there's another book in this, Dr. Pillay. I think that there is an idea here that we are not masters of building fulfillment into our lives. I think that's a topic unto itself. But let's go back to psychiatry again, because that's your specialty. Is it possible that depression or suffering of any sort might be a result of this behavior, that we have injured ourselves in some way by not downloading our brains in a way?
Yes, I think depression is probably caused by a number of factors from genetic to environmental, but I think one big piece of this is brain overload. I think when you get this kind of brain overload, you don't actually allow your mind to wander and you start being very constricted. One of the things that people don't realize about depressed people is that they actually are more reality oriented than non-depressed people, which is kind of interesting, right? Because you'd be like, really? Depressed people see reality as it is. Non-depressed people see beyond reality into possibility. So one of the mechanisms that I like to teach people is I like to say one of the unfocused techniques, if in your day you build these 15-minute periods, like maybe when your brain would be in a natural slump, mid-morning, after lunch, mid-afternoon, right at the end of the day, if you actually build these unfocused periods into your day, then your brain is free to do what it needs to do. But if you don't have these unfocused periods in your day, then you are more likely to overload your brain. And when you overload your brain is not really free to do what it needs to do. And studies have shown that when your brain is in this more wandering state of mind, you start to feel happy and even euphoric. But when your brain is contracted, you may see reality as it is, but you remove possibility. And Albert Einstein said that you cannot solve a problem at the level at which it is created. So people who say, I don't have enough money, and are trying to solve that in reality, are really solving it in the wrong mental zone. You need to ask yourself, how is that possible? And if people are saying, I don't have a relationship that I want, totally get it. But if you only solve that at reality, then you're not imagining. And your brain responds biologically to imagination. Imagination stimulates the action center of the brain. It's a way of providing information to your brain's navigator so that your brain's navigator will tell you where to go. Whereas if you stay stuck in reality, your brain's not navigating anywhere. You're just going to be where you are, trying to say, how do I change my life? What do I do? So people think possibility is a soft concept, but in fact, it's not. There was one study, for example, that looked at people who were given 3 tubes of cream. So the one tube, they were all the exact same cream. One was labeled lidocaine for pain relief. The second was labeled capsaicin, the active ingredient in chili. And the third was labeled neutral. And they asked people to put it on, and people who put on the cream and saw it was lidocaine said, wow, this feels really calming, because they knew that lidocaine was for pain relief. But there was this exact same cream, the one labeled capsaicin, when they put it in their hands, people were like, wow, this stings a little. And the people who put on the neutral said, it's just neutral. And when you went and looked in their brains, those people who believed in the possible positive outcome, the reward system in their brains was lit up. Whereas the people who believed that something negative was going to happen, the pain centers in their brains were activated. So in your life, if you go around genuinely believing that life is just going to be handing you pain over and over again, your brain goes into that pain-related state. Whereas if you believe in the possibility of something better, and this doesn't mean you have to say something ridiculous like, I'm going to get $1 billion tomorrow because I can. That would be great if you can do that authentically. But really what you want to say is, I've got a powerful unconscious. My unconscious can lead me to my goals. And even if I don't know how to get there consciously, I'm going to tell my brain, this is my vision of my life. This is the way I'd like to imagine it. Please work on it while I'm just going about my day.
Dr. Pillay, do you have to keep some of these ideas to yourself? Because I think they're remarkable, but you're in institutions that are notorious for sending the opposite message. I mean, you went to medical school, you are at Harvard. Come on, do they really get this idea of unfocused time and the use of it? I mean, it seems to me that those institutions are hammering you to produce.
There is a lot of the produce, but I think people recognize that they don't get the best work out of you unless you build in this unfocused time. Certainly at Harvard, it was the case. In fact, by the time I was the chief resident in my final year of training, and we would basically mark people down if they didn't free up their Mondays and Fridays. We would say, clearly you don't know how to build a successful life. Like, you're not only at Harvard so you can just produce. Yes, we want you to produce, but we also want you to figure out how to live a good life. So if you want to really be superior in some way, by the time you get to your 4th year, you need to figure out how to make the money you want to make in the 3 days a week, and the other days of the week, figure out a way to create freedom, because that's what will make you truly smart. So I think that these institutions, there is a paradox about them, which is that there's a high degree of output and productivity, but they realize that you need these times. I mean, companies like Google, for example, have napping pods at work. Zappos has a napping pod because they know that they will get more out of their workers if they give them a chance to build these unfocused times in. I think with these ideas around imagination or these ideas around possibility, some people at Harvard will always raise an eyebrow and say, really? Like, why are you telling the world to imagine? So I said, well, just look at the biology. If you look at sports medicine, when sports people want to get better at high jump, at lifting weights, at diving, and there's a lot of data to show this, They are not just doing the sport, but imagining doing it will activate the movement center of the brain and prepare the brain to be able to do what you need it to do. So I think as long as you back it up with data, they're comfortable. I mean, my general philosophy when I talk to people about this is I say I both believe and don't believe what I'm telling you. When they look at me, they go, well, what do you mean? I say, I've done a lot of research. You know, like research sometimes goes in opposite directions. Sometimes you ask yourself, really, is that really for me? And it's also biased to a certain extent because people often research only what they're interested in. Like I'm very unlikely to research the fact that steak is bad for you because I like steak. But if you had to force me to choose something, I might say, well, I'll try to do a research project that sea urchin is bad for you because I don't really care if the result is that it's bad for you. So it's the same thing with diets, the same thing with a lot of research. I think we don't know. I have a huge respect for research, but I think for us to use it effectively, we have to ask ourselves, is the study conducted well? Number one. And number two, does it apply to me?
I want to go back for a moment to your book and back to me for a moment. You know, I believe there's this notion in physics that an object at rest stays at rest and an object in motion stays in motion. So when I'm resting, when I'm taking a break, I'm often, I'm really comfortable. And I find it's even harder sometimes to go back into work. So how do you handle that? I mean, how do you create unfocused time that isn't too seductive?
Well, I think there are a number of ways to think. Firstly, I think it's important for us to understand what's wrong with focus. So, as I said, focus is great, and I'm a huge proponent, but doing it all the time, I'm not a proponent of. And here's why. There are 5 disadvantages. So the first thing is to realize what's wrong with just focusing all the time. The first thing is focus depletes the brain of energy. So a study was done that looked at 2 groups of people who were looking at videos. One group had to look at the video with intense focus, and the other group had to look at the video just as usual. And they found that when they gave them a problem to solve to help people after that, the focus group couldn't care less, whereas the unfocused group tried to solve the problem. Then they fed the focus group glucose, and they started to care again, indicating that if you focus all day, you lose your compassion because it depletes your brain of energy. So that's the first disadvantage. The second is that focus gives you tunnel vision. So Anne Wang, for example, who founded the word processor, was busy making his word processor 2, not realizing that the PC was on the horizon. And so if you don't look at what's happening around you, you're not going to know what's going on around you. The third thing is with your nose to the grindstone, focus prevents you from seeing upcoming trends. You know, if you're a sports journalist and you're just there writing up your sports histories and writing up your games, you may not realize that robots are taking over sports journalism. They actually, all you have to do is feed them information. They can write an entire article. So if you're not looking at upcoming trends and looking at the future, focus is problematic. Also, focus is about, creativity is about making connections in the brain. When you're focused on one point. To make connections, you really have to be focused on multiple points. And lastly, when you think about focus, it's the unfocused parts of the brain that overlap with the self circuits in the brain. You know, that feeling when you're just walking about on a great mountain or along the ocean, you suddenly start thinking like, wow, I feel so good. I mean, the flow. When you are in that state, it's the unfocused circuits that are activated. And that's because focus helps you pick up puzzle pieces, but it's building in these unfocused periods will help you put them together.
Okay,
So
you've made a good argument for this, Dr. Pillay. And I don't mean to interrupt you, but in your book, you talk about shift cost. And when you shift out of unfocused to focus, or focus to unfocused, there's some sort of cost. And I want you to talk about that, and also the other part that you talk about what insecurity does to our brains. So pick the one you want to talk about. But
sure.
you made the case for the unfocused rhythm, but what happens when you have to move from one to the other?
So when you've got to make a change, your brain goes into a conflict state. It's called cognitive dissonance. Think of it as brain chaos.
Okay.
So the moment you say to your brain, okay, I'm going to lose weight. I'm going to make more money. I'm going to go to the gym more frequently. I'm going to go out and meet someone. Your brain's first response is a freak out, like, oh my God, what's happening? And the anterior cingulate cortex of the conflict detector starts going haywire. So your brain has to pay a price to make that change. And that price is reflected in that chaos because we prefer what is familiar to what is right. So when you do that, you've got to pay the switch cost. And the switch cost is the psychological price you pay for change. And so what that means is when you're making any new change from focus to unfocused, for example, your brain is saying, oh my God, this is unfamiliar. What if I don't make it? What if I never come back? What if I don't finish my work? So it's unfamiliar, it's frightening. And so you've got to basically bargain with your brain to help it say, you know what, I am paying a price, but I really want it. It's like if you wanted a great pair of shoes and you know it was a little bit above your budget, you have to convince your brain that there's something good that's going to come out of that. You could say, I'm going to go on this date. It's a really important date. I need these shoes. I have nothing else. And your brain will say, well, okay, I know you can't really afford it, but buy it. It's fine. Similarly, if you're going to change to unfocus, you've got to do what we call spreading of alternatives, which basically means alternative A is I'm going to focus all day long, don't want to do your unfocused thing. Your alternative B is I'm switching to unfocus. Now your brain's got to buy the fact, like that's the reason I gave you those reasons up front. It's got to buy the fact that unfocus is going to increase its energy. It's going to allow it to not have tunnel vision. It's going to allow it to see what's happening in the future. It's going to allow it to actually be more creative, and you're going to feel more self-connected. And with each of those, you have to make sure, you have to ask yourself, how do I want to, like, I understand that we've got habits and ways of living. We all do, so do I. But I think we have to ask ourselves not what our predispositions are, but what we are committed to in this life. Are we committed to having a more energized life? Are we committed to having a life that feels like it is the freedom that we want? And so I think to the extent that we can, when you make a list of all those positivities, the moment you start, your brain starts realizing, you know what, maybe he's on to something, and maybe I actually ought to give myself a chance, then this chaos settles down because it activates the left frontal cortex, which quiets down the chaos in this conflict detector. So that's the first concept, that if you're making the switch, you list out the reasons for why you want to do it, but make sure it's authentic, and don't stop until your brain buys in.
Dr. Pillay, your book, Tinker Dabble Doodle Try, Unlock the Power of Unfocused Mind, we just tapped a little bit in. Is there anything crucial that you want to add that I've not asked you about?
No, I think I would love for people to consider whether they think it is worthwhile to be their best. And if it is worthwhile to be your best, then give yourself a chance.
And read the book. Thank you, Dr. Pillay. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Phyllis.